Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. Joining me today is Vanessa Beeley, here to follow up on a story that has been developing, that we've been covering the last couple of days in regard to Syria. Really, honestly, for quite a while. March 8th for the most part, but long before that, if you understand the full breadth of the story, which is the discussion around, I think March was the wrong month, the discussion around the idea of the fall of Assad and the overtaking of that country. Now, obviously, there's a lot of mixed narratives and a lot of misinformation flying around. The obvious facts that we can see is that the group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, that Vanessa and I have talked about more than once, that she's been doing work around for a very long time, clearly has been backed by the U.S. and Israel. These are facts that are on the table. The interesting overlap is what's happened since, and the argument this is some kind of a popular revolution, even though the evidence on the ground with ISIS patch wearing support, people supported by these two entities that are extremists, whether Al-Qaeda, ISIS overlap, executing people in the streets. All the time forward now, we're coming back to a kind of partisan focus on the conversation when that very same group, when they've tried to whitewash and put him in a suit and act like this is some kind of, literally, I can't believe still that they use the term, now I'm going to forget. It wasn't like it was something about a woke jihadist or something in that mindset about somehow a rejuvenated jihadist. And the idea being that this is somehow different. And now the partisan focus is why we're seeing a mass slaughtering, a massacre of Alawites largely, but really just anybody in the wrong location in a coastal area or happen to have the wrong accent. And this is exactly what we were talking about. And what Christians included, but really just anybody that is in the wrong place at the wrong time. That this is what would happen when the people that we have been pointing to for a very long time were allowed to take power. And this is ultimately what the Assad government had been fighting the entire time. And now the interesting conversation where the people who supported those groups, who told you that they were in power now because of their airstrikes, because of what they did, are now turning around and saying, look, this is why Muslims are bad. Here's the radical Islam that we've been fighting, even though you can draw a straight line back from them to the funding of these very groups, proudly supporting them as it was happening. So Vanessa's here to tell us what's really going on, as usual. Somebody who is on the ground fighting these things, showing you the truth from day one, and hopefully that truth can break through today. So Vanessa, thank you for joining as always. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. I noticed that we've got the usual internet gremlins whenever we get together. It's kind of a little bit delayed when I'm listening to you, so we'll try to overcome that. We always seem to have this problem.
Yeah, every single time it seems in a really obvious way, but it's the way the world, that's the technocratic world we live in. But thank you for taking the time, because I know that this is a very serious and I know emotional and personal conversation for you. And it's something that, I mean, really, it's human life and suffering. So I think it should be for everybody with, I guess, compassion. So thank you for taking the time to talk about this, because you could tell me to what degree you think it's worse or less or what it's been in the past, but I've never really seen whether it's just the partisan kind of political conversation or the foreign policy extension of that. It's a little bit unnerving to see how wild it's gotten, whether it's about free speech or anything else, where it's just like the diametric opposite of what they're claiming. And yet it just doesn't, people that want to support it will support it anyway. I mean, this is a really bad conversation. So, I'd like to start, if you could, for those, I'll include all of our previous interviews and the conversation we've had going back a long way. But for those that want to get caught up in all this, but I'd like to start with, what is the reality of Syria right now? Because I've made this point in the past about other locations where, the Balkanization idea, where these countries don't really exist anymore, but yet the name is on the map, any number of different things. Like we're seeing the moving of borders for every aspect of what Israel is, but the conversation stays the same. We pretend that these things are still the same country. Does Syria still exist in the context of what Syria was? And what's the reality of that on the ground from a governmental standpoint? And before we even get into what's happening today.
Yeah, it's very difficult to see Syria as still being what is a sovereign nation. Its borders are not under its control. Israel, since December the 8th, when the international coup successfully overthrew the Syrian government and put in power an Al-Qaeda junta, with no mandate from the people whatsoever, that junta then proceeded to dissolve the parliament, to dissolve. They came in with a mandate to hold elections and to rewrite the constitution. And of course, that is one of the reasons that was used by the West to demonize President Assad, is that he was delaying the rewriting of the constitution, and yet as soon as he elected, Jolani was basically saying that elections would not happen for 4 years, the constitution would not rewritten for at least 3 years. And so, you know, almost immediately it became very apparent that this was a government that was completely illegitimate, but was legitimized immediately by the Western countries like the US, the UK, the EU, the Gulf states, by Turkey, even by Russia, who were very fast to go and legitimize the government with a visit by the Deputy Foreign Minister Bogdanov very shortly after Jolani came to power. I'm calling him Jolani because I refuse to call him by his adopted name of Ahmed al-Shara. He's Mohammed Abu Jolani, Abu Mohammed al-Jolani. And he's still HTS, he's still Al-Qaeda. His entire government is made up of Al-Qaeda elements, the majority of whom have Turkish citizenship, right? They can't even legitimately be called Syrian. The new Syrian army, because of course he completely dissolved not only the Syrian army, but even the Palestinian resistance factions within Syria. So while claiming to support Palestine, he's actually dissolved all of the Palestinian resistance factions and taken away their arms and reduced their status to refugees. They were never actually refugees in Syria. They were always given citizenship, but they were not given naturalization in Syria to enable them to have the right to return in Palestine. That's a very important point to make. Syria was one of the countries that did the most for Palestinian refugees after the Nakba of 1948. And then, of course, almost immediately, I mean, even on the day that I managed to get out of Damascus, Israel was destroying Syria's defense and offense capability from a military perspective, destroying their air defense capability, their air bases, their radar equipment, their navy, all of their military installations, including their development and research centers from where they had, to a large extent, been producing the weapons that were being sent to the Palestinian resistance and to the Lebanese resistance in their war against the illegal occupation by the Zionist entity. And so, yeah, you know, almost immediately, Syria really ceased to be the sovereign nation that we all knew. And it became very clear immediately again that the plan was to partition Syria. It's becoming very apparent now that the reason that HTS to a large degree was imposed upon the Syrian people was to create such an extremist sectarian atmosphere where ethnic cleansing pogroms were ongoing from the 9th of December onwards, despite reassurances from Jolani that you know, people would be safe and so on. People were encouraged to come back to their towns and villages. Soldiers were encouraged to basically apply for amnesty. Those same soldiers now are being executed on the spot again across Syria. And, you know, so therefore, where is Syria now? In the south, of course, it's now under Israeli control. In the north, largely under Turkish control. In the center, under the control of the various HTS elements, which include probably 40% foreign mercenaries under the HTS umbrella. In the northeast, you have still US bases, and in the east, on the border with Iraq and Jordan. And of course, the US is controlling not only the Kurdish separatist factions that have now just signed a deal with HTS, we'll come on to that in a bit, but they're also controlling ISIS, the ISIS holding camps in the northeast, and sort of redirecting them to previously carry out attacks against the Syrian Arab Army and their allies inside Syria, but now also redirecting them towards Iraq. And towards attacks not only against the Iraqi resistance factions, but also against, for example, electrical power stations and so on. In other words, destabilizing civilian infrastructure in Iraq, just as they did for the last 14 years inside Syria.
Yeah, so there's a couple things I want to ask around that. So in regard to the resistance aspect of it. So, I mean, obviously you answered the question in regard to Syria, and that's exactly what I would think as well, is that this is it essentially doesn't exist anymore in the sense of what it actually was, now that they've not just because the power is shifting, but because they're going to break this up into different locations. I'm wondering whether they ever even, like, is it going to be Kurdistan on the map, or are they just going to still make it Syria? I guess we'll have to wait and see. That's my point, is that it's just about the narrative going forward in a lot of this. But in regard to like a resistance aspect, I'm still seeing, as you pointed out, Israel, I think yesterday, the day before, like continuing to bomb certain locations. Is there any verifiable element of resistance that would represent, even just against fighting whatever this is, maybe even still trying to reinstall some kind of Assad control? Is there any of that still happening in regard to what's happening on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, you do have, I think what they're calling themselves is the Islamic resistance in Syria, which of course is similar to the Islamic resistance of Iraq. They have been carrying out isolated attacks against Zionist positions in the south. There have been some protests, for example, in Quneitra, in the Druze communities, in Sweda, even in Dara, all of which are areas south of Damascus, against Israeli occupation. But effectively, the HTS government has, I mean, while they're massacring Alawites and other minorities on the coastal areas, and even down into Hamar and near Homs, for example, they're ignoring the consistent expansion by Israel into Syrian territory. Now they're moving forward north of Dara, which, as I said, is south of Damascus. They recently got involved in clashes between the Druze factions in Jaramana, which is a kind of a suburb to the southeast of Damascus, very close to the Shia Muslim pilgrimage shrine of Sayyidah Zainab that was regularly bombed, of course, by Israel during the former presidency. And they're basically piggybacking the Druze conflict with HTS and issuing statements that they will come to the protection of the Druze against HTS. They are describing HTS as an Islamist extremist regime, despite the fact that, of course, they supported them since 2011. They provided them with arms, with hospital treatment, with air support, very important of the kind of nations. Israel was there offering air support for them against the Syrian Arab Army. Now they're playing the game of kind of describing it as an Islamist extremist regime, saying that they will come to the protection of the Druze. The Druze are basically putting out statements saying, we didn't ask for this. But if you look at the trajectory of basically where Israel wants to end up, it's the David corridor. So what that means is full control of territory south of Damascus, and then a corridor going up the eastern flank of Syria, joining with the northeast, which of course is under the control of the Kurds that are also very much backed by Israel. And then finally entering Iraq up to the banks of the Euphrates. This is part of the greater Israel map. And so that's very clear that they see their support of the Druze as being part of that ability to expand their territorial gains inside Syria. And I think it's also very important to make a note that right now, Russia and Israel appear to be entering into partnership inside Syria to basically push back against Erdogan's neo-Ottoman ambitions. And so Israel is actually lobbying the United States to allow Russia to maintain its bases in Tartus and Latakia on the coastal areas, the eastern Mediterranean coastal areas of Syria. And, we're seeing this collaboration now between Israel and Russia being very much as a pushback, as I said, against Turkey. And I think, we have to remember to some degree, it's believed that really Turkey betrayed all of them by because the initial intelligence was suggesting that HTS was kind of supposed to stop at Aleppo. In reality, of course, we know what happened for various reasons, and no, the Syrian Arab army didn't surrender all its weapons. It was also betrayed. Commanders who were still fighting were taken off the field. Russia was effectively bombing empty land. It wasn't bombing the HTS convoys that were information they took from on the ground while I was there, and also after I Damascus on the 8th of December. And so, really, this is Russia's way of saying, right, like, we'll get our own back now, because Turkey pushed HTS forward and its own Syrian National Army, which were formerly Free Syrian Army, which are the Muslim Brotherhood factions under the control of Erdogan and Ankara, pushed them forward into Damascus when Damascus finally fell. But in reality, the groups that actually entered Damascus first were the Russian-formed 5th Legion, which were formed out of armed groups in the south that were also very much supported by Israel. They were the first, excuse me, to enter Damascus. So what's clear to me now the conflict is to a degree between Turkey and Israel, although they collaborated in the first place to overthrow the Syrian government. And of course, we know that Erdogan has been supplying oil from Baku. It's been supplying materials to make weapons and so on to Israel throughout the Palestinian genocide, despite claims that it stopped. We know from people that have been tracking the shipping and so on that it has continued, basically.
And just to make sure, because it was cutting out a little bit throughout that, so you said that it seems as if Turkey and Israel are the ones kind of, no, it wasn't your fault, obviously. So Turkey and Israel were the ones that are fighting essentially over Syria. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, basically, the initial coup was a collaboration between very much Turkey and Israel to overthrow the Syrian government. Okay. Yeah, but now what we're seeing is that there is potential for Erdogan's neo-Ottoman empire ambitions to clash with Israel's greater Israel expansionism. Yes. Right. And so therefore what Israel is now doing is trying to rope Russia in to a degree. Mm-hmm. And I have to say Russia appears to be coming rather willingly into that partnership to have control of the coast through Russia maintaining its military bases. And basically to be able to take control of that northeastern corridor to prevent the Ottoman expansion into Iraq and towards Azerbaijan, of course, because Turkey and Israel have some control in Azerbaijan, well, a lot of control in Azerbaijan, leading up to the borders of Iran.
So this is really interesting. I want to make sure we at least touch on the Russia part of that, and what you feel from that, what your thoughts are on that based on the previous, situation. But before that, so what's interesting first, actually notice for those that haven't really seen this is not a hypothetical. This, as you guys probably know, it's even a patch on their uniforms right now. Greater Israel is a very real and public discussion. There is a part of Greater Israel that goes into Turkey, right? But note that it literally has designs to take half of Iraq, most of Syria, part of Kuwait, half of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt. Like this is what it looks like to have a real globalist mindset or authoritarian aspect. But the interesting part here is that when we first talked about this, right, when we first got together right after that, and by the way, I did think I said the wrong month. I think I was correct. I think I said March on accident. December, obviously not 3 days ago. We meant December 8th. But the point was that when we talked about this right afterward, what was interesting was that we were kind of theorizing, right, because we didn't really know what was going on. And one of the things we were discussing was what actually happened in regard to why, and one of the theorizing points was whether Israel essentially had just taken advantage of the situation and rushed in and taken more territory. But it sounds like that might have been kind of the design from Turkey and Israel. And I'm curious what you think, what U.S. was that part of their plan as well? Like everything seems to be happening, seems to be to their detriment for everybody else. And I just find that to be very conspicuous. But then I also want your thoughts on Russia's play in all of this in regard to, is that Russia double crossing Syria, or how do you see that? Like, I find it hard to wrap my mind around them willingly working alongside Israel with all that we thought was happening before in regard to Syria and Russia. And, so what are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, well, I think from the United States point of view, of course, one of kind of one of Trump's election mandates that he gave himself was to withdraw his troops from Syria, and that had been one of his mandates back in his first administration. And so it would be to the US advantage, because right now, I think Trump is not focused on Syria. He's not particularly focused on the Middle East per se, other than sort of closing. And I don't mean to sound sort of very cynical on this, but literally closing the Gaza file, closing the Palestine file, and bringing about the normalization of all of the Sunni Islamic states, you know, including Saudi Arabia. That is his ambition, apart from his, you know, waterfront development ambitions also in Gaza and so on. But I think for the US, it would be hugely advantageous if Israel took control of that eastern corridor and coming into the northeast, because what would that mean? That would mean Trump can withdraw his troops and know that that area is safely under the control of their strongest ally, if not, you know, their military outpost in the region. What is interesting for me is this SDF contract that's just been signed between the SDF and HTS, bringing SDF under the control of the kind of new Syrian army, although I would contest whether it's Syrian and whether it's an army or just another terrorist faction basically being created, another part of the Takfiri project. But if that happens, that actually brings the nemesis of Turkey, which are the SDF, under the control effectively of Turkey's proxy, which is HTS, but HTS also double up as a proxy for Israel and for the United States. So, you know, there's a lot of maneuvering going on right now, and whether Turkey sees this as a potential avenue to be able to end the Kurdish problem, if you like, in the northeast, and to give them potentially, let's say, at least joint control in the northeast, to give HTS access to the oil, of course, which was always denied to President Assad and to the Syrian government previously. And there is potential that there's been a deal done by Israel to allow this, to allow basically HTS to have access to their resources in the northeast in order to turn a blind eye to Israel being in the south and extending their reach beyond the illegally occupied Golan territories. Now, coming back to Russia, I mean, I think we talked about this, what actually happened during the battles, and it became very clear that, and it's becoming even clearer now, I have to say, that a deal was done between the United States and Russia over Ukraine. I mean, that's pretty much what we've seen since Trump was inaugurated, as we've seen these discussions over ceasefire. We've seen Zelensky going through the theater of getting, you know, slapped, basically, and now coming into line, right? And it's very clear that a deal was at least in the making before Trump was inaugurated, and then of course it all started processing, right? And so in my opinion, and it was kind of interesting, I was talking to someone here who has studied the relationship of Russia with the Middle East for some time. And as he said, look, you know, we have to understand that Russia's red line is actually Israel. It's not going to do anything that's going to threaten the stability and security of Israel in the region. And how Russia perceives partnerships, Putin looks for strong partnerships. So, for example, it's currently partnering, for example, with Iran, because it sees Iran as a country that is a sovereign country. It has managed to develop and grow despite the sanctions that have been imposed against it for decades. Its borders are secure. It's a sovereign nation. It's a strong sovereign nation. right? The same with Turkey. Turkey, effectively, is a new Ottoman empire. It was previously an empire, but it's a strong nation. How Putin views the Middle East is very much as this hodgepodge of countries, never being stable, never really managed to maintain its sovereignty, except for Yemen. Apparently, he has a lot of admiration for Yemen because of what they've achieved, particularly since 2015, and under sanctions and under war. They've still managed to maintain their sovereignty, and they managed to do certainly the most damage, in my opinion, economically.
Right.
Israel began the genocide against Palestine back in October 7th, 2023, right? And so I think there was a mixture of things. I think, first of all, President Assad was simply not complying. He wasn't negotiating with Erdogan, which Russia does, see or did see very much as an ally in the region, right? And they wanted Assad to negotiate with Erdogan, at least to come to the table, which Assad refused. I think Russia had been pushing Assad more towards the Gulf states, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and developing that relationship over and above the relationship with the resistance, in other words, with Iran and even Hezbollah. And there is evidence that Iran and Hezbollah were also aware of that. And then, of course, there was the cost of remaining involved inside Syria. We also know that a deal was done in Doha, that Assad would step down after a 6-month interim period during which a coalition government would be formed, right? And we also know that there was an intelligence meeting. I think it was about 2 months before the attacks. And we know that that intelligence from meetings of Syrian military command, Russia and Iran, somehow didn't filter down to the president, right? So there's a lot of stuff that was going on, which intimated that there were plans in the pipeline to basically, maybe Russia had the intention to leave Syria in safe hands, but in the end, what happened, apparently, is that as the Syrian army was withdrawing from Aleppo, was starting to regroup and fight back against HTS, around 15 of the command were removed from the battlefield by the chief of staff, who was obviously part of the betrayal, and imprisoned. And the army was withdrawn back to much further south, and then started to collapse because brigades within the army were being told to surrender. Others were keeping fighting, and then realizing that they were fighting alone because their comrades next to them had surrendered and laid down their arms, and so they were suddenly surrounded, right? I'm kind of oversimplifying it.
Yeah.
And then it was basically a Russian backed commander, Suhail Hassan, who took over the battlefield. And at that point, it started to collapse. Russia was no longer bombing. It hadn't really been bombing the convoys, which is insane because convoys coming from Aleppo to this particular area, there's no coverage. It's flat, open plain land, right? So Russian Air Force could have bombed the entire convoy and prevented its advance. They didn't. Right. I mean, it reminds me of ISIS coming from Iraq to Syria back in, when was it? 2013, and traveling 500 kilometers, and America didn't do anything to prevent it.
Right. I mean, it's hard not to see this as, I mean, at the very least, taking it's opportunism, like whether or not it was an attempt to do the right thing or whatever, we would see that as, it's clear. Like, I guess where my mind goes is that, look, it's objectively clear this government is committing a mass genocide, multinational national genocide. How can you, even if it's in your benefit as a nation, support or align yourself with that? I just think, this has to represent what the, moral ambiguity of government today. And I think that's a problem for me. Maybe it's not for everybody else. But what I would like to get into in all of that is, to what degree I mean, even what you just described kind of really does even suggest again that it was like maybe Israel did take advantage of the situation, or alternatively, as I think a lot of people have been arguing for a while, that all of this really was for Israel, at least from the United States perspective, like fighting their wars for their outcome. So from your research and what you can see now, or even give us like from then until now, and then what you see today, how much is Israel on the ground? Because our reporting has seen bases being built, deployment of troops, even discussions of new settlements for settlers in Syria. So what's the reality of that on the ground, and to what degree is Israel occupied and like taking over Syria right now?
Yeah, to a large degree. I mean, they don't have the manpower, it has to be said, to fully settle on Syrian territory. And that's why they're looking for proxy settlement through the Druze, through the Kurds. But there is a sizable military occupation inside Syria, yes. And of course, if you look at it combined with Lebanon, they immediately took control of Mount Hermon, which is close to the Lebanese-Syrian border. It's the highest point from which you can basically surveil pretty much all of southern Lebanon and southern Syria across to Damascus, right?
Same with
and in southern
Syria. Sorry, forgot the gap.
Yeah.
Forgot the delay. Go ahead.
I think we're not doing too bad considering how sort of up and down it is. And in southern Lebanon also, what they've done, despite, of course, the ceasefire conditions that they should withdraw entirely from southern Lebanon, they've maintained positions on 5 of the highest points in southern Lebanon, which again gives them a vantage point from which they can carry out surveillance operations against civilians in southern Lebanon. And so that's part of their strategy also, to maintain surveillance on any resistance activity against their illegal occupation of Lebanese and Syrian territory. And basically what they've been doing is establishing settlements in southern Syria. They've been digging in those images and videos being released fairly recently of them sort of digging in fortifications and so on. They've been moving in heavy machinery, and they are gradually moving closer and closer to Damascus, yes. Now, ultimately, as I said, no, they're not going to have the manpower themselves to be able to settle quickly into these territories. So that's very much why they're courting the potential of proxy settlement in these areas.
In regard to actual, do you have any insight onto, I mean, I've seen the conversations, but I know some of these, what's her name now? I'm forgetting her name, very prominent at this point. I even think she just got nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, which makes me sick. The leader of these radical settler movement that are proudly discussing the stealing of property in Lebanon, in Gaza, you know, in everywhere. I've seen them publicly discussing. My point is that doesn't necessarily mean. But are you going to see? Do you see any evidence of those kind of settlements being proposed for, you know, the settler movement?
Yeah, what in southern Syria, you mean?
Yeah, specifically in Syria, anywhere, because we've already seen it pop up every other location that they're trying to push into.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, this will be ultimately the plan. We haven't, as far as I know, we've not seen anything yet. There aren't any settler movements moving into southern Syria. No, not yet. I think partly because I think that would be a step too far. For Syrians in the south, even in Daraa and Sweda, because although there are Druze factions that, let's say, are certainly, you know, would not be against Israeli occupation, they're a minority. And the majority of the Druze, as far as I'm aware, traditionally always believed in the integrity of Syrian territory and would oppose Israeli occupation.
We've seen that.
What is now, of course, the situation that is now being orchestrated is that anything is better than HTS, right? Yeah. And this is exactly what they're engineering and they're orchestrating. And when the US starts to make statements that, you know, they're condemning the atrocities against ethnic minorities inside Syria, of course they're not, any more than they condemn Israeli genocide in Palestine. And what are they doing? They're asking HTS to investigate their own crimes, their own atrocities, their own ethnic cleansing, exactly as they do with the Zionists. You know, oh, well, we'll ask Israel to investigate, you know, its slaughter of 300 civilians in one bombing raid. You know, this is what the US does. It's just a kind of a legalese fig leaf to cover up the fact that they're absolutely quite okay with all of this going on. Because what does it mean? It means, and I mean, I was in northern Lebanon today, we can talk about that, but I actually went there to meet with Syrians that are fleeing the ethnic cleansing pogroms, the atrocities, the massacres, the slaughters that are going on in the coastal region down as far as Homs. And to now, there's almost 8,000 people. 8,000 have come from Syria into Lebanon, and they're crossing not by a border crossing, they're crossing by smuggling routes, they're having to cross rivers. They told us today, they're being hunted by HTS drones. So they're literally having to move through forests. They're getting targeted by drones. There was one guy who said to us, you know, I spent 5 days in the river because it wasn't safe for him to cross. And he was keeping himself under the water as cold as possible because the drones detect heat, body heat. And so they're not only getting slaughtered in their homes, getting executed, getting, you know, tortured, abused, dismembered. When they actually flee, they're still being hunted down. And, you know, I can't, we saw the 1,000-mile stare in Gaza when prisoners returned to Zionist prisons. That was something very similar that I saw today in entire families, children, mothers, men from the family, young men, who were just totally traumatized by what they'd had to witness in Syria. Extraordinary. I mean, just awful. I mean, we're looking at a second Nakba, in my opinion. The numbers of dead now in Syria are anything between 8,000 to 12,000, and we don't know because entire villages are being slaughtered in silence. There's no internet, there's no food, there's no water. Water's actually being poisoned, according to reports today. Bread has been poisoned. They've had internet cut off, they've had their phones taken away. So we've got no communication from many of these outlying villages and towns. Today, I was told basically they're being completely slaughtered. So we don't know what the numbers are, but they're certainly in the high thousands.
Yeah, I saw Kevork, and I think you as well. And he estimated about this might be somewhere around 10% of what's actually happening on the ground. You know, the information that we're actually seeing come through on the internet. Now, what's important to point out is you can draw. It's a very clear correlation between what you're seeing, which is not surprising, the U.S.-Israeli extremists doing to people in Lebanon, the U.S.-Israeli-backed extremists doing to people in, you know, any location you want to point out, Ukraine, for example, right? It's the same atrocities in the same manner with the same kind of gleeful sociopathic action. You know, like it's this weird, you know, it's everywhere. Now, even the poisoning aspect, like I'm not, it's obvious to see that there's a reason, whether these people are acting for some Zionist mindset or not, that this stuff is being allowed in clear ways for the same kind of agendas. I wanted to point this out, seeing so this is a similar thing we continue to see that also was happening in Gaza, even, and it goes all the way back to these origin conversations that, in the case of specifically the Zionist organization, calling it some kind of a blood libel point. Just to make it clear, this is from Haaretz. This was written on in 2022. And what it is actual documentation going back to the 1948 Nakba, saying this is evidence of the Zionist entity poisoning the wells of the people in these locations, which has become some kind of blood libel claim that their Jews are poisoning the wells. No, we're talking about Zionists, to be clear, and this is a provable fact. And it's happened more than once, and it happened again recently in the context of Gaza. And so it's interesting to see these correlations, and I think that's important to point out. But in regard to what's actually happening on the ground, So let's go. I want to hear about what they were saying to you in Lebanon from what they saw, and let's get into all of it in regard to what we can see on the videos, the ethnic cleansing, but also you had mentioned some overlapping points about human trafficking, organ trafficking, like the really dark side of this, which you and I've talked about in the past, seem to be pretty common in a lot of these foreign policy wars. But in particular with this, I'll let you get into it. So what is going on the ground? We went over a lot of these harsh videos yesterday. We talked about the mass slaughter of innocent people, so break it all down for us. Like what's actually happening?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, the videos are circulating online. Of course, what is Western media portraying it as? They're portraying it as regime remnant insurgents that is basically leading to the massacre of civilians. But of course, this is absolute nonsense. Any resistance operations came in response to the killing and the ethnic cleansing that had been ongoing since the 9th of December. It didn't just begin 4 days ago. And of course, it had been ongoing since 2011 by the HTS, various rebrands and their affiliates, right? If you go back to 2013, in Latakia, on the coastal areas in an area called Baluta, 200 civilians were massacred by the Free Syrian Army, Nusra Front, and Ara al-Sham, so a combination of 3 groups that, of course, then are now being absorbed into Jolani's new Syrian army. And those civilians were massacred very much for the same reasons. They were Shia Muslim or they were Alawite Muslim, and they didn't comply with the fanatic Takfiri ideology. So that was back in 2013. And who prevented that becoming, as it is today, a wholesale slaughter? And I would call it a genocide, because it is effectively the attempt to exterminate an entire minority sect, not only the Alawites, but also the Christians, the Sunni Muslims that do not, that protest these massacres of their Alawite neighbors are also getting slaughtered. There was a Sunni sheikh in Damascus who spoke out against the ethnic cleansing. They came to his house. They tortured him. They executed him in front of his son. And this was only 2 or 3 days ago. The Christian priests that are taking Alawite families into their homes to protect them are also coming under attack, right? So, this isn't only, this isn't some kind of new civil war. This is a continuation of the ethnic cleansing that was begun in 2011. Yeah, sure.
Just really quickly, I want to just, so in that one point about the Sunni aspect, does that seems to be a common thread here about, what does that suggest to you that it's not really about the ideology? For some of them, it seems to be clearly, but from the leadership level, sort of like Zionism, Judaism, like a lot of these different points. I mentioned Mohammed bin Salman in the past, alluding to the fact that even like the ISIS elements that they manipulate, some of the leadership doesn't even believe the ideology, and that's how they manipulate the underlings. Like in this context, the same with like Zionism, when you see the idea of beating up, Jews that protest against Zionism, like it shows you that's about Zionism, not Judaism. Do you see that in that, or does that represent something else to you?
Yeah, it is very similar. I mean, Takfirism or Wahhabism, which is a fanatic branch of Islam, actually is very far away from Sunni Islam generally, and is not really, it's not acceptable to the majority of Sunni Muslims, particularly in Syria for the last 14 years. There is a slight shift now, which again, I'll come on to, which is extremely saddening to hear today from the testimony that I listened to today. And so this kind of fanatic Islam, of course, who produced it really were the British. The British were behind largely the creation of Zionism. They were also behind the creation of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Ikhwan groups in Egypt in the late 20s that have been weaponized against Syria for decades, going back to Hafiz al-Assad and even prior to that, right? And so that entire connection is there. And yes, of course, there are very clear parallels. This is basically a Takfiri project, but of course, it's in tandem with the Zionist project.
Right.
Right. And the Muslim Brotherhood is being weaponized to serve both agendas. And so therefore, it's because it's so far removed from what Sunni Islam should be, right? The majority of, I don't like using the term moderates, but the majority of the non-extremist Sunni,
You're cutting out.
Muslims in Syria are opposed.
Oh, did you lose you? I knew it was going to happen at least once. So far, it's been reasonably, we could hear what's being said for the most part. But so far, this is the first time it's been a gap this long. Well, since we're paused here, and I hope she comes back because we have really important stuff to get to. The interesting thing I'm touching on there, as we've talked about a lot, is this, the question really comes to whether or not, let's just take the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, or some of these weaponized aspects. Do they actually represent a religious fanaticism? Oh, did we lose her? Oh no, she's back in. There we go. Let me see if this one. There we go. Perfect. I had to get rid of the other one.
Am I back?
So I was just saying that was the first time we had that long of a gap. So far, it's been pretty okay. What I was simply saying is, I guess the larger posed question is, does something like the Muslim Brotherhood or something like that really represent Muslim fanaticism, or is it something that's been created to weaponize that? Now, my point is that underneath that, there are people that adopt the ideology, and maybe I'm wrong in that in general, but it's interesting to think about and how these things are used. And the more we dig into this Zionist long-term project, it seems that's what their bread and butter is. I interviewed David Icke, and he talks about Sabbateanism and sort of this foundational aspect of before Zionism became a thing, and that's what its foundation is, infiltrating religions and governments and using, it's hard to ignore all that, Anyway, so now that you're back, go ahead, continue your points.
Yeah, and if you go back historically, even to the famous Hafiz al-Assad put down of the uprising in Hama in 1982, which of course is always described as a massacre of insurgents in Hama, but the reality was nobody talks about, for example, the car bombings that were carried out by the Muslim Brotherhood factions, or the fact that they entered the Aleppo military cadet school and segregated the Alawite and the Shia cadets to execute them. And the Sunni Muslim cadets refused to abandon their comrades, and so they were executed alongside them.
Right.
And this is very much what we're seeing now. Unfortunately, and I haven't really worked out why this is happening right now. What we are seeing, according to the testimony that I received today, is that, for example, if you have an Alawite town in the middle of Sunni Muslim majority towns, the Sunni Muslims now are starting to turn against the Alawites. They're being actually influenced by the Takfiri ideology, which for me is one of the saddest things I've heard, because Syria was always Syria first, and your faith, your belief, your sect second. The fabric of Syria was so diverse and inclusive. And if this is getting broken down, then unfortunately, the Israeli clean break doctrine plans, the Western plans to effectively break down Syria into partitioned sectarian statelets, which, this is their project in every country that they intervene in and attack. From former Yugoslavia, Yemen pre-2015 was going to get also partitioned into, I think it was 6 statelets, isolating the Ansarullah resistance factions in the center, with landlocked with no access to the sea, etc. So this is a fairly common denominator in neo-colonialism projects right now. But unfortunately, since the December coup, we're seeing it have greater success in Syria. And I'm sort of very a little bit shocked and very saddened by that, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, you can go back to the 70s and Zbigniew Brzezinski and the general idea of the Balkanization of the Middle East. I mean, this has been a long-term plan, as you're highlighting. It's not, it's been consistent in most regards as well. But or even the overlap of as I think Jeffrey Sachs laid out, the book Netanyahu's written, 7 countries, 5 years discussion. Clearly, this has been an ongoing effort of Israel fighting these things through the United States. I think that's pretty clear, at least one part of what we're talking about. But so what's interesting is what you're highlighting there is also a very consistent aspect of previous genocides that have been stoked by the Zionist entity. And this is not, I was talking about this yesterday, that it seems we're discussing these things. This is not some hypothetical, let's see how we can connect it to Israel. It's a documented reality of how Israel's government was involved in, for example, the Rwanda genocide, right? It's not an opinion. You can look this up on Wikipedia, for crying out loud, which is what I always say is, doesn't mean we should think Wikipedia means it's proven, but it means mass adoption. It is also proven, by the way. And it's interesting that it shows that the Israeli government was stoking this in the same way you're highlighting, was fanning the flames of the racial division, and this is all documented stuff, was arming the side, and then from the beginning, middle, and afterwards were involved in the whole thing. And this is just disgusting that it's that obvious. And so we see these things in the same way today, where as you're seeing, they're stoking these racial divides to the point to where they're destroying what was previously not what they claim. Everywhere they're going, they're claiming to fight the extremism, but in reality, as you're highlighting, they're ultimately destroying religious freedom and installing exactly what they claim they're trying to fight. Or at the very least, that becomes the reality because they're not, you can frame it however you want. The outcome is pretty much the same. With the Christian populations in Iraq, the 3rd largest Christian population in Syria being destroyed, all of these things being targeted. I guess on that fine point, do you think this is a focused effort against Christians in some way, or is that a byproduct?
I think the war against Christians has been ongoing for a very long time, since even, Crusader times, but rather it's against the pan-Arab ideology, the unity of Arabs. That's what they're trying to destroy, basically, because Christians here consider themselves to be first and foremost Syrian Arabs, right? Or Lebanese Christians, Arab Lebanese Christians. It's that Arab identity, which is key to how they perceive this war, that it's a war against Arab identity, basically, which is true, which is entirely true. Arab identity, Arab history, Arab culture, Arab civilization. And you can see that incredibly clearly, for example, in Damascus, where what is being destroyed? Christian churches, Alawite mosques and shrines and centers, Shia Muslim shrines. All of the history of pluralist coexistence in Syria is effectively being destroyed, leaving what behind a partitioned Syria with a dominant Takfiri government in charge. And, if you go back through the CIA, DIA documents, this is what they've always been trying to achieve in Syria. And they've always known that Syria is against it, that Syria is opposed to it. That's all recorded in the CIA various branches and agencies documents describing what they want to achieve in Syria, right? And because for Israel, having these warring factions, let's say, in controllable statelets is how it likes to basically govern or take control of territory that it's expanding into, because that is what serves its agenda. And with this current exodus of Christians, because Christians are also being targeted by the Takfiri elements. And what we're seeing, again, is the exodus of Christians from the region. And that has always been on the agenda, because then basically they leave it open as a Sunni Shia, I'm simplifying it because, of course, there are multiple sects in Syria itself and across the region, but very much as a Muslim against Muslim war,
Right.
rather than a war to defend Arab identity against the neo-Crusader movement, of which Israel is part of, by the way, right now. And you've got all of the kind of Christian Zionist elements in the Trump administration and the Armageddonists, as I call them, you know, that are heralding in the end time war and so on. So we're in a very dangerous tipping point, both regionally and globally. And you mentioned Iran. The jury's still out for me a little bit on Iran as to whether they are actually going to go after them because of the complications within Iran itself. Although I actually saw Pezeshkian just before I came on, sort of basically saying if Trump was going to threaten Iran, then, you know, to hell with him, basically. So at the end of the day, I don't know if we're going to see conflict between Israel and Iran, of course, backed by the United States. I'm not sure we're heading in that direction, but where we're definitely heading is the complete destabilization of West Asia. Iraq now is, you know, certainly going to be targeted, in my opinion. Yemen, the war is going to start there again. I think tomorrow is the end of the 4 days that al-Houthi gave Israel to basically restart the humanitarian supplies into Gaza before Yemen takes action. And Yemen is also speaking very strongly about what's happening inside Syria. So
Oh, do I lose you again?
oh God.
Oh, there you are. You're
Honestly,
back.
I don't know.
You're back.
I'm back.
So got most of that. You just said that al-Houthi was basically saying that, you know, that they're going to go back to, like, if they don't, they bring back the supplies in, that they're going to, you know, take action against Israel, and it basically cut out right there.
Yeah, well, yeah, basically, and he's also been very strong about what is going on in Syria. He's made the point that all of this serves Israel's agenda and Israel's expansionist policy in the region. And, you know, he pretty much did issue a fairly strong warning that the ethnic cleansing has to stop in Syria, the massacres have to stop. And, you know, the saddest thing for me is that people that I spoke to today, for example, are still talking about the international community. Why isn't the international community doing something to stop this massacre and this brutal slaughter, you know, of civilians? They're not regime remnants, they're civilians, babies, children.
Right.
Girls are being raped and trafficked, children are being trafficked. Yes, there is organ extraction going on again with the white helmets on the scene and mopping up after the Al-Qaeda atrocities, just as they have always done historically since they were established in 2013. There were reports that we heard today of children being taken for organ extraction into Turkey, but also that it's actually being done on the ground in Syria.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, this is one of the worst parts of these conversations. I mean, it's hard to partition out the worst parts of a genocide, but you know, this is always something that we've seen going back to the earliest parts of the Syrian regime change effort, where, I mean, there's been articles about the, you know, the missing children of Syria. You know, this always seems to be something that takes place in these wars, specifically that seem to be the Middle East wars from the U.S. and Israel. But I think it's pretty much just what happens in conflict, sadly and disgustingly enough. But so, what do you see that is suggesting that at this point? I mean, I have that clip, by the way, that you shared with me of white helmet vans dumping bodies on the side of the road. So actually what we should do, to be honest, if you can give a quick overview of the white helmets, because actually it's been a while since we've had this conversation, right? For those that don't even know, and we don't have to get so deep on it, but give them the basic background of what the white helmets, not the actual Syrian civil defense group that they're pretending to be, but the white helmets with English writing on their backs. What is that? And how is it playing a role today and what's going on?
Yeah, well, I mean, the white helmets were established in 2013, not inside Syria, in Turkey and Jordan. They were set up with money from US aid. So from the CIA, from British military intelligence, from MI6, from the UK Foreign Office, from Qatar, from Turkey. And they were basically embedded with Al-Qaeda and the various armed groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda in order to produce the narratives, literally produce the narratives. So the staged chemical weapon events that would criminalize the Syrian government and provide cover for the armed groups, right? And they became sort of a household name for rescuing people under the rubble, all of which, of course, was total propaganda, lies. And one of the accusations that was thrown at them by multiple civilians that I spoke to, there was a panel produced by Russia at the UN in 2018, basically running an investigation into the White Helmet involvement in organ trafficking, in child trafficking, the use of trafficked children in the staged chemical weapon events that have been fully debunked, as for example, Duma 2018, which was actually debunked by OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and ground in Duma, Damascus 2018. There's multiple reports written by Dr. Piers Robinson on the subject. There's been a book published actually called The Syria Scam by one of the actual OPCW inspectors. And so the White Helmets were there to generate the evidence to corroborate US-UK foreign policy in Syria, which was regime change. And of course, they always moved with Nusra Front or Al-Qaeda. So when the Al-Qaeda terrorists were moved out of the liberated areas in the green buses to Idlib, the White Helmets didn't stay behind to take care of Syrian civilians. They moved with Nusra Front to the new front lines. And so now what we're seeing is White Helmet involvement again in the mopping up of the Al-Qaeda slaughters, the removal of bodies, throwing of bodies down mountainsides into rivers, the burning of bodies to hide the evidence. And they are being associated again with what is being reported as organ trafficking operations, organ extraction operations that are ongoing on the ground in Syria. I mean, that's what I'm being told. There are actual doctors and medical staff basically removing the organs from the injured, from the freshly killed people, and also taking the children for organ extraction. People basically stopped sending their children to school, according to what I heard from mothers today, because they were so scared of these operations. And that's exactly what I heard in Aleppo back in 2017, 2016, just after liberation, and also in Eastern Ghouta in 2018, 2019, after liberation of the suburbs of Damascus in the east of Damascus. I heard the same accusations being, thrown at the White Helmets by civilians that had lived under their occupation.
Yeah, and this the same things we saw in Gaza, Al-Shifa, and plenty of others. For example, I mean, this is a pretty common reality that we've seen in these wars, and it's pretty unnerving to see how public it seems to be. And so, you want me to play that video from that you shared from the White Helmets? Is that relevant time to share it? I'll go ahead and bring it up.
I didn't get some of that.
This is the video that you shared with me in regard to the White Helmets being seen on the side of the road dumping bodies. I just figured it was a good time to share it.
Mm.
It really just takes a second. They're driving down the road.
اللي هو تابع للهيئة عم بلموا الجثث مشان ما يبينوا بس تيجي الأمم المتحدة لك وين سياراتن هي هن اللي عم بلموا الجثث روح كفي.
You see, that's very clearly White Helmets right there, or at least the or the pretending to be.
روح خلاص روح.
So go ahead, if you want to give us some background on that.
Yeah, I mean, basically this was recorded. I don't know who was recording it actually, but there's this one showing them disposing of bodies. There's another, there's another bit of video footage which I think was picked up by Russian surveillance of a white van, which is not identified as white helmets, but could very probably be throwing bodies from the back of the van over the mountainside into the valley below. And again, from the testimony that I was given today, the white helmets were definitely coming in, cleaning up after the massacres, and also involved in looting and burning of homes after the killing of the inhabitants. So, you know, most Syrians know who they are. They know that they're Nusra Front Civil Defense. I always remember when I was asking, you know, do you know who the white helmets are? And they would look at me in complete confusion until I said, okay, Nusra Front Civil Defense. And then they would laugh and kind of say, oh yeah, no, we know who they only put on the white helmets when they're filming. Otherwise they're Nusra Front. You know, they're not disconnected from Nusra Front in any way, and they're not paramedics either, which can be pretty much evident from the majority of their videos that they're
Right.
normal paramedic procedures in any of them.
Well, there you go. You lost you for a second there. Well, so I should point out that for those that may not have connected the dots, al-Nusra is at least part of became Hayat al-Sham, as we've talked about before. And so when she's staying al-Nusra,
Yeah.
think the group that's currently in control of Syria. And that's what's so unnerving about all this. The work that she's shown of them beheading children and smiling images of this, you know, women in cage. I mean, this is the same groups that are currently in control. And that's why this is so upsetting, unnerving, alarming to people that have been like us, they've been following this, have been covering this, to watch them just on a dime be like, nope, never mind. Now they're good. Here's a suit. And even the overlap of not even removing the bounty on his head until like 4 or 5 days after they were in power. I mean, and then weeks, I mean, like, think about how crazy it is to go off that provable evidence and then having this from Israel. Jihadists in suits are still jihadists, right? The massacre in Syria proves it. And having all these Elon, you know, kind of lackeys like screaming about how this is why Muslims are bad. Loomer comes out and says, here's why we shouldn't have Muslims in Congress. Like, it's insane what they think they can get away with. It's just, these are disgusting. It makes me sick. But the important part on this is to recognize who's behind this, who's driving this, who's allowing this to happen. So with what you've highlighted in regard to the organ trafficking, human trafficking, you know, all the worst parts of this, where are you placing this? Are these extremists that have been empowered that are just doing what they do, or is this being driven by some kind of a state actor? You know, how do you place all the stuff that you're seeing? Even in regard to the massacres, is that just a byproduct, or is that because that's something that somebody wants to happen?
I mean, I think definitely that is something that, you know, the West, that Israel wants to happen, because basically, of course, Shia Muslims, the Alawites, and so on, these sects tend to be those that are the majority of the resistance. I mean, at the end of the day, who was defending Palestine? Yemen, Hezbollah, the Islamic resistance in Iraq and in Syria, right? And so therefore the destruction of, if you like, the resistance factions and the reduction down to Sunni Islamic states having dominance, which means normalization with Israel, as we're seeing with the Gulf states that, of course, are incubating and funding these Wahhabi terrorist factions, and have been since 2011 and even prior to that. Turkey and Qatar, of course, are the backers of the Muslim Brotherhood factions. And so, therefore, if you look at it in that way, this is what it's about. It's about the dominance of the proxy forces of those that want dominance in the region, if that makes sense, right? And so, therefore, the removal of any impediment, any faction that may, let's say, foster some kind of resistance against what is going on, the fracturing of Syrian society into partitioned territories, for example. And it's not by mistake that we see Israel now coming out with statements in defense of the Alawite sects.
Right.
And again, that in collaboration with Russia on the coast, maintaining Russian bases on the coast. Hamimim has taken, I think it's in the region, actually I'm really not sure how many currently are inside Hamimim base. And another point to make actually here to show how this is so deliberate is as soon as HTS came to power, the EU closed its borders to these persecuted minorities. Whereas during the Assad presidency, EU had opened its borders to what were majority radicals and extremists that are now embedded in Europe and are coming out with statements in support of the Takfiri project in Syria, right? Now the borders are closed to the genuinely persecuted Syrians who are genuinely fleeing what is a genocide against a minority sect inside Syria. And at the same time, they're lifting the sanctions again, or at least lessening the sanctions against HTS, right? And they're inviting Jolani to donor conferences. I mean, this is like, you just can't get. I mean, I'm laughing because the obscenity of it is so kind of tragically absurd that it's. I don't know what else to do, really.
Well, and there's stuff like this. For example, this was on the 7th. UK unfreezes Syrian central bank assets. They're in the middle of an ethnic cleansing that everyone's watching, and you go, yeah, here's your central bank assets back that we froze under Assad's regime. Like it's very clear, as people have pointed out more than once, that what the US and Israel and the EU, the UK, and what they've been doing is funding the most radical elements of Islam for decades in order to use them against the people that won't just bow to their interests. And that's not necessarily good guy, bad guy here. Like you could argue that the other side of it is bad in their own ways, but they're unwilling to bow to the interest of a foreign government, usually at the expense of their own people. And, and even if they're enriching themselves in that same situation, they then run to the worst people and say, here, give them money and arms, and then throw them against the person that they're trying to remove from power. And then when they take power, they just let it become exactly what they said they were trying to fight. And this is very consistent, and this is what we're seeing take place right now in front of us. We're watching. I mean, this is the proof. Right now, we're watching. I even saw, I think it's Alan Mizrahi's account on Twitter that I'm not familiar with him personally, but I've been watching his coverage and discussion throughout post October 7th. And I appreciate a lot of his takes, but I didn't like his opinion on how Syria was going. I just disagreed. And I recently saw him come out and say, you know what? I have to admit my ignorance on this. And, now I'm seeing finally what Assad was actually fighting. It's like, well, good on you for adjusting your opinion to information, and it's obvious to see. It's always wrong, in my opinion, to try to make a good guy, bad guy. But you can see what they were actually fighting at this point, and you can see what we've been trying to highlight. And to your point about the border, that's actually really relevant to a lot of other conversations, that this game that's being played about, like there's weaponized immigration, migration all over the place. Israel and the US have been doing it forever. And what's interesting is you got the right all radicalized about trying to highlight, the Soros, which is certainly part of it too. It's a partisan game. There's non-partisan, highlighting they're weaponized or bringing in military age males. And what you're highlighting there is that they're the ones welcoming in that problem and then stopping it when it's the actual innocent people. And, and then the point is they demonize the actual people on the ground when it's the people that, it's very weaponized, and it's never one thing or the other, but it just shows you how very clearly contrived the whole thing is. And that's what always makes me the most sick about this is it's, people who just, a murderer is a disgusting person that needs to be criticized, but a person who is a murderer, but then calls for you to praise them for doing good things is like the worst thing in the world. And I just see that everywhere today. And that's what these people represent to me. So, I mean, there's a lot of other ways we could get into, a lot of directions we could take this. Is there anything else that you wanted to make sure we talked about before we kind of wrap up today? Because I think this is a good kind of encapsulation of what's going on. But if there's anything we're missing, please let me know. Because go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, I think your point about President Assad, and I think that was very much the topic today, was that all of these people who have fled to Lebanon with nothing, I mean, literally nothing, just the clothes on their back, still have family inside Syria, so they can't even, I couldn't film them, I couldn't photograph them, I can't use their names, because literally their Facebook pages are being monitored. Even if they put a like on someone's post, their family is going to be slaughtered, Literally, that's how insane it is. And remember how they said to us, you know, oh, in under Assad, you know, no one can speak out, no one has freedom of speech. And, you know, basically what everyone was saying to me today was, look, under the two Assads, so under the two President Assads, we never had this. Nobody in Syria ever wondered who their neighbor was. You know, they took in Sunni Muslims who fled from Idlib, for example. They took them into their communities. Now those Sunni Muslims are turning against them, whipped up by the HTS Takfiri ideology. And, you know, as they said, this never happened under Assad. And there are multiple things that I'm hearing. You know, you hear, well, everything's going to get better now. You know, there's no electricity. There's no system. The Wi-Fi is way worse. There's no water. There's no food. The majority of Alawites and ethnic minorities have been laid off. They're unemployed, right? And so unemployment is sky high in the country. So all of this talk about lifting sanctions and you know, economic recovery and inflation coming down is absolute nonsense.
Right.
But the people are not able to protest. They're not able to say anything against HTS. And they're living in absolute misery right now. And the West is completely ignoring it because they endorse what is going on inside Syria. They created this. This is what they engineered. This is what they wanted to happen, for Syria to be weakened and terrorized to a point where it accepts foreign intervention, where it accepts partitioning, where it accepts Israeli occupation as being better than HTS. And I am hearing that, by the way, from people on the ground, which is just, you know, I mean, it's kind of off the scale crazy for me. You would never have heard that, even during the most poverty-stricken times under President Assad, which was from 2020 onwards, where Trump's Caesar doctrine sanctions really started to seriously impact the economy. And yes, of course, there was corruption. Of course, there, you know, but a lot of it be blamed on 14 years war, sanctions, economic pressure, the occupation of resources and agriculture, the burning, deliberate burning of agriculture and forestry and so on, you know, and an ongoing low pressure war until December 2024. And so I think it's very important for people to understand that while things might have not been great, they might have been difficult. There was a system under President Assad. Even me living in Syria for 5 years, I knew exactly what hours of electricity I would have. I knew that the water came every 48 hours from the government. You know what I mean? There was a system. I knew how to deal with it. You were dealing with a known quantity. Now you're not. People are living in a complete free fall limbo. And you know, it's kind of terrifying on all levels, from the ethnic cleansing level, but even from an economic level, from a lack of future level, from a not knowing where on earth the country is heading, who's going to be in charge in the next 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. Nobody knows. It's in a complete free fall as a country. And yes, you know, there are resistance elements forming, as there always will be, but the country has been, to a large degree, so battered and besieged and savagely attacked for the last 14 years. It's very hard not to feel that the Western agenda, the Zionist agenda, is not inevitable, you know?
I know. It's such a hard thing. Like, I keep struggling with that just around the Gaza, you know, the genocide taking place in Palestine, and the idea that it's like I know that everyone's the wrong term, since that is hyperbolic, but like the vast majority of the world people see this. That's just that's undeniable at this point. And yet, even in this country, left and right, I think most people are acknowledging, and yet we turn around and it's like they're not even flinching. They're not even like, not Biden, not Trump. And it's like, okay, do we just not understand how the power dynamic works here? Like, I don't think it's voting, that's for sure. But, you know, it's just like, so we have to reevaluate how we have an effect in this regard. And it's really unnerving to see that whether or not we all see it, that it does seem to march forward regardless. And that does seem to suggest impunity. And it's like, that's what we need to stop. Like, we need to find a way to make sure that's not the reality we live in. But it's hard. I mean, this is a gut check moment for people around the world to see what power we actually exist under. And the point should be made, by the way, to reiterate, actually, that what you're highlighting there about Syria in the conversation, you expecting that's because of the way it was turned into, right? That's how Syria was. That's because of the U.S. destabilization of that country, right? Like, it's this long-term attack under same with Venezuela. It's like starving these people and turning around and going, look, they can't even feed themselves. You know, it's just sickening how clear it is. But I actually think that more people than I've ever seen are beginning to see this. But again, like I just said, whether that has an effect on the outcome or not is a different conversation. But it's still good to see that people are, you know, the truth and acknowledging that truth is the first step in any real part of change. And so I'm really glad that that's happening. But the suffering is hard to stomach, you know, and I'm glad that people like you are there on the ground, choosing to continue to cover this and putting yourself at risk to do so because you believe in that truth. So it's worthy of, you know, commend, you know, respect. But I think what's important is that people continue to cover this, continue to follow your work, support your work, and keep fighting for this truth. I mean, we need to evolve this into other conversations about how we actually see this translate into real change. And you know, maybe government is not the answer. I mean, you know, I think that, but I hope we can have these conversations. So thank you again for being here today. And, you know, anything else you want to leave us with on the way out?
No, just thanks for having me on, Ryan. I'm sorry the internet was a bit flaky again, as per always when we get together. But you know, it's always really good to talk to you and talk through things.
Yeah, well, thank you as always for joining me, and I hope this was insightful for everybody out there. And I'm sure we'll be connecting in the future. So thank you for tuning in. And as always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
Discuss the situation in Syria after the collapse of Assad's regime, a collapse that was made possible by Israel's weakening of Iran's terror axis, especially the weakening of Hezbollah and the removal of Nasrallah.
This starts, and it's really fascinating to go back. It starts in 1996 with Netanyahu, who wrote a book called Fighting Terrorism. And the thesis of the book is quite straightforward and very dangerous. He says, you know, there's Hamas, there's Hezbollah, they oppose Israel. It's not good for us to fight them directly. That won't work. What we need to do is topple the governments that back them. So what we need is regime change throughout the Middle East. And he actually gave a long list of 7 countries that included Syria, Libya, Iraq, Iran, Somalia, Sudan, and Lebanon. And systematically, the United States has done Netanyahu's bidding for almost 30 years now, going to war with every one of them, except for the big one that Netanyahu so much longs for, which is the war directly between the United States and Iran.